Hello everyone, I hope you've managed to get onto the live event well enough. Hi, I'm Andrew, welcome to today's webinar. Obviously, if you've been tuned into previous webinars, you'll kind of know where we're coming from on this. Last time, a couple of weeks ago, we did a first view of the new BizTalk Migrator released by Microsoft. And today, we are going to look in some more detail. So we're going to have a look at what the tool actually produces and look a bit more at some other sample scenarios. So if we look at, here's our presenters. So there's me, and I'm also joined by Dan again. Dan is CTO of Afnis, and as you all know by now, Dan is the world expert in Logic Apps. So great to have Dan on board again. And yeah, the webinar series, obviously the last time we had a first look at the tool. In this one, we're unpacking the tool and looking at some more sample scenarios. And in the next webinars, we're going to look at the code base next time in a bit more detail. We're going to look at the repos, maybe do some debugging, that sort of thing. And then provisionally after that, ultimate user guide. So do stay tuned on this series because we've got loads and loads of good stuff coming up. So in today's webinar, we're going to look, briefly, the BizTalk Migrator ships with 4 different test scenarios. We're going to look into the file XML scenario because that's such a foundational piece of BizTalk functionality. And we're going to look at what it looks like in BizTalk and then what it looks like in Azure. And we're going to deploy the Azure solution and have a look at that. And then hopefully after that, we've got time for Q&A. Now, last time, apologies, the Q&A didn't work. This time round, I hope I've ticked the right tick box, and so the Q&A will be there because it's always like the best bit is always getting the Q&A and getting some feedback from you guys. So really looking forward to being able to do some Q&A today. So if we look at the test scenarios, and one of the purpose of shipping test scenarios with the BizTalk Migrator, as far as we can tell, is that it's almost like Pareto principle, isn't it? You've got to cover the most important scenarios, and so with 20% of the coverage of BizTalk, you can get maybe 80% of the solutions done. So if we look at some of the scenarios that are shipped, the one we had a brief look at last time was FTP pass-through, which was simply receive a file from FTP, pass-through pipeline, publish to the message box, send port, subscribes to that pass-through send pipeline, and send out via FTP. But that's just the core of pure messaging without anything else, just a pure messaging scenario. The next scenario uses a file adapter, XML, and it's got maps in the receive and send port. So again, a pure messaging, but in this time we're actually using XML and we're using mapping because that is again such a common and such a foundational piece of BizTalk functionality that it's really it's really important to do that. The third scenario that's shipped is FTP. So it receives FTP with XML, but that goes into an orchestration. The orchestration has a map in it, and then there's a one-way send via FTP out the other side. So again, that's like the next foundational building block, which is actually parsing an orchestration. And then the final scenario is an HTTP request response that goes into an orchestration, and there's a map in the orchestration, so that the response is from a map in an orchestration. So again, that's actually also a really interesting challenge because, as you know, with BizTalk, you've got a receive side, and then that goes into the message box. The orchestration has to correlate a response back through the message box back to the original request that's waiting. So that's actually, in terms of creating a solution that parses that, that's a really interesting problem. So these are all on GitHub. What we're going to look at today in a bit more detail is the XML scenario. So as you know, in terms of what this solution looks like in BizTalk, I'm not going to dwell on this because you all know this, But on the receive side, we have a file adapter, and the file adapter is the thing that picks it up off the file system. It picks the file up off the file system. That goes into an XML receive pipeline, and obviously an XML receive pipeline will parse the XML. It will try to match that XML up to a schema, and then if there are promoted properties, it'll promote those properties. But it will also promote the metadata about the XML. So it'll promote the message type. It will promote what the root node is and all that sort of thing. And then that goes, and then there in this scenario there are two maps on the receive side as well. So depending on which XML, depending on what the message type is in XML, that will be used to then select the appropriate map before publishing that message into the message box. And then on the send side, we've got a couple of maps on that. And then, so again, depending on which message has gone into the message box, we've got choice of map. That then goes to an XML send pipeline. So again, that uses content demotion and that sort of thing, potentially. And finally out through a file adapter, again on the send side. So we'll have a look at this in a demo now. So just bear with me while I share my other screen. Okay, so here we have a VM, and I've gone onto GitHub now. So I'm actually so I've got the repositories for BizTalk Migrator. Actually, I've got them all starred in GitHub. So what we have here is so I think we might have talked on this briefly last time, but aim tool is actually the command line. Aim Azure is where we have templates that are the ones that use to generate. Aim model is the model that's populated with data that is used to represent the BizTalk application, but also represent the Azure application. Aim core is the core sort of interface to components that run the thing, and aim BizTalk is where all the BizTalk action happens. So I'm going to delve into there first. So if we look in GitHub, obviously on GitHub we've got these are in the because Microsoft's put this out as part of the Azure organization. So it's github.com /Azure/aim BizTalk, and aim comes from the term Azure Integration Migration. And then obviously this is the library that's got BizTalk. So if we look at the library in the BizTalk, we've got there's the source folder, but then we've also got the scenarios folder. So I'm going to delve a little bit into the scenarios right now. So if we look in here are the 4 scenarios that we talked about just then. So there's FTP pass-through, there's this XML mapping that we're going to look at right now. There's the simple orchestration, which we said was the one-way receive, one-way send. And then there's the orchestration with HTTP, and that was actually using JSON. So just to demonstrate that you don't have to just use XML. And again, if we look in the XML mapping one, we've got a source folder here, which is the actual BizTalk solution. So that's got all the BizTalk stuff. So yeah, so there's some schemas in here and some maps. And we've also got a bindings folder. So obviously you've got the BizTalk bindings, so you can actually create the application off that. And then there's the MSI, and the MSI, so aim.xml mapping.msi, is the exported application. So we can run this through the BizTalk Migrator as an example. So what I'm going to go to next, I'm going to go to Visual Studio just so you can see very briefly what some of these things are. So we've got, for example, a payment schema, and that's got an amount and a currency and a date and time that the message is received. We've also got a payment inbound schema, which is just amount and currency. And then we've got a payment outbound, which is amount, currency, receive date time and send date time. And we've got a receive map, which is pretty simple. It maps the amount and currency and generates the receive date time. And then we've got a payment send map, amount, currency, receive date, time, and we generate, say we generate a send date time. So those are the payment schemas. I'm going to be using those in the example today, but there's also a registration schema. So this is just as far as we can tell, this is just to demonstrate that you can put two completely different XML messages through the same pipeline, and the whole thing of choosing the appropriate map and that sort of thing based on message type. So this is a very similar thing, but name instead of amount and currency, it's name and age, but it's just a registration. So that is the BizTalk solution. So if we now go to BizTalk, the BizTalk admin console. Now what I've actually done is those 4 MSIs that are in BizTalk, I've actually deployed those MSIs into my local BizTalk. And so here's this AIM XML mapping one. So again, we can see that we have a receive location that is a file receive location that goes to BizTalk app input, and it's filtering on star.xml. And so that is a receive port, and in that receive port, we've got that one receive location, and we've got these 2 maps, payment inbound, also the payment receive map and the registration receive map. So we've got 2 maps in there. Also in that receive location, in terms of the pipeline, we've got the XML receive pipeline. And then on the send side, we've got a single send port that is going to send that to BizTalk app output, and then the message ID macro.xml. And if we look at this send port a bit more, this is actually using a pass-through transmit. I thought that was going to use an XML transmit, but that's okay. If we have the filters, so it's just filtering on the receive port name, and then we've got again two outbound maps. So we're taking a payment, we're doing a payment send map and going to that payment outbound schema. So in classic BizTalk style, I've got a let's just get some let's get some folders up. So what I've got here is an example of that inbound payment message. So if I look at that in Notepad++, we've got the payment inbound and just some currency and amount. And this is just to demonstrate that the BizTalk app actually does work. But remember the days when people used to go, wow, when you paste a folder and paste something into a folder, and then a message would come out the other side, and everyone go, wow, what an amazing product BizTalk is. I'll pay 10 grand for that. So here we are. It's the there we are. There's the pretty printed XML. So we've got the amount, we've got the currency, but we've also added a receive date and a send date. So that just demonstrates what the scenario does. So as you saw last week or 2 weeks ago, we then ran the BizTalk Migrator. So I've got a command here. I'm not going to dwell on this because we did this last week, but we can run the BizTalk Migrator, and that will migrate this app and produce some output. Obviously very verbose, it's chugging away, it's doing a lot of work, and any second now the migration will have finished. So what I'm going to do now is just very quickly, as you know, the first thing we can do is we can fire up the report, and then we can look at the report and then say, well, there's our BizTalk application. We always get a message bus application, we get a system application, and then and here's the solution that's been generated. So we can look at some of the components here, and Dan in a minute is going to take you through the details of these components. So we've got a file receive location, which is the file trigger. We then have, if you remember from last time, we have a routing slip router, which is the component which says what piece of work we need to do next, which allows us to have a decoupled application. We then go to the XML disassembler, and then that obviously decodes the XML. We then go through another routing slip router, which says what we're going to do, and then we go to the XML message translator, which is where the mapping goes on. We then go to another routing slip router. We then go to the content promoter, which obviously is promoting the content into the message context. We then look at where we go next for another routing slip router. We go to the message publisher, which sends us to the message box. So that's how the receive side has been generated, and then the send side, we've got obviously we've got the send port is actually subscribing to the message box. Using a publish subscribe. We then have this ubiquitous routing slip router. Then we have an XML message translator, which is where we're doing the send side mapping, and then we have the send port. So we've gone straight out. So that is a quick run through of where all those bits are in that application. So what I will do now is I will flip back to the presentation, and this is where Dan can start to pick up and take you through. Let's just so Dan, feel free to tell me to move the slides on. So I'm trying to talk and drive the webinar at the same time. Maybe I should stop doing this.
I've got the presentation as well, so I'll share.
Okay.
And I've just got to work out what I'm sharing. It's going to be here. If you let me know you can see that. How's that looking?
It's looking splendid.
Excellent. All righty. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Andrew. OK, so moving on from what we've done, you've seen Andrew's talked about the scenarios and running the tool and going through the report and a quick look through what we get. It's probably worth now going through exactly what gets deployed. Because as you run through this tool, and not just from the scenarios we're doing now, but when you run it with real clients, BizTalk applications, you start to get to know all the stuff really well, which is what we've been doing. So when you run the tool, you're always going to get a minimum of 2 resource groups. Okay, one of them is called message bus, one of them is called system application, and then for every MSI that you're parsing, you'll get an additional resource group that represent that application. And we talked earlier, Andrew talked about these as being common components, and that is true. The message bus is a set of components used for any integration scenario. So it's like a library that any integration scenario can use. The system application is effectively BizTalk specific artifacts. So you can think about it in terms of the message bus is common stuff that you use for any integration bus, whereas system application is what BizTalk supplies on top of that. So it's kind of similar to the BizTalk system application. There's some additional stuff in there. And then you have a separate resource group for each of your BizTalk applications, so your MSIs, and that has stuff that is specific to your application in it. So if we look at the types of things that are in there, in the message bus, we've got the config store, and that's using Azure App Configuration. We've got a routing or a routing store, which is also using Azure App Configuration, and that's storing your routing slips and your routing properties. The config store is storing configuration entries used for all the scenarios. The artifact store is an integration account, and that's where your schemas and your maps and everything get deployed. Then there's Azure API management, and inside there are a number of APIs. So there's a config manager, which is just a front end to the config store, and a routing manager, which is a front end to the routing store, and a messaging manager, which has just got some policies in there that use the config manager and the routing manager to do additional work. Now, we had a conversation with Microsoft at one point about why we've got APIM in front of it, and the reason for that is caching. So the Azure App Configuration doesn't, at this point, have any built-in caching ability. If you're not familiar with Azure App Configuration, it's just come out of preview, I think, and it's designed for giving you sort of geo-redundant storage of configuration information, similar to what you might use SSO for in BizTalk. You can spread it across regions, or you will be able to. You can link it into Key Vaults. You can store, stuff in Key Vault that you can access via Azure App Config. And you can label things. You can have different values. So you could say, well, for this key, I want the dev value, or I want the test value, or the UAT value, or the prod value, that sort of thing. So it's kind of cool. It's up until it was released. If you wanted to store configuration information in Azure, you were using, table storage, in Azure Storage, or using SQL, or you're using a NoSQL database, or writing your own storage and file, or something like that. So it's quite cool. They have something now, although the interface for it is not as good as it could be. Then we've got Key Vault, we've got Azure Storage, we've got a single logic app, which is the routing slip router we'll talk about in a minute. And then we've got some functions, which do all the work behind, like the messaging manager, for example, calls a whole series of Azure functions to do the actual work. And there's also App Insights, which I haven't shown on here because it's not used that much at the moment. Right, and then the system application contains all the things that you would recognize from BizTalk. So we've got the service bus in here. This is actually the equivalent to the message box. So we've got a number. I think there are by default 3 topics in there. There's one for the message box. There's one for a suspend queue, and then there's one for HTTP request response, or at least request response processing. And then all the subscriptions get created in here. I'll talk about that in a minute. But then there's a JSON decode logic app, and a JSON encoder logic app, and a flat file decoder logic app, and a topic publisher, and a content promoter, an XML processor, and all the rest. So everything, all of these get deployed. So the first time you run the tool, all of these 2 sets get deployed. Yeah. If you run the tool again using the same unique deployment ID, it won't redeploy all these, because the system generates incremental ARM templates, which means that it ignores anything that hasn't changed. And because generally these won't have changed, it doesn't need to deploy them. So all it ends up deploying second time through is everything that's in your application. Now that's important to know, because the very first time you run the tool, it's going to take at least 40 minutes, sometimes 45 minutes to deploy. And that's due to this bad boy here, Azure API Management, which on average takes about 35 minutes to configure and deploy, which is annoying. But there's nothing we can do about it. So, but the next time you come and run a deployment, you'll find that if you're using the same region and unique deployment ID, then it's just deploying on top of API management, and because nothing's changed, it skips it effectively. And then all it has to deploy is what's going on down in here. So inside the application are the things that are specific to your BizTalk application. So your receive port, your send port, the topic subscriber. If you think about it, you're subscribing to the message box to get something into a send port. So in BizTalk, the send port has a subscription. The way this tool works is it's generated 2 separate things here. The send port is actually the bit that sends it out at the far end, so the adapter, if you like, and then the topic subscriber is the bit that subscribes to the message box. You can also have a process manager. We haven't covered these yet, but in a later scenario or webinar, we'll look at that, and that's the orchestrations. They get converted to what's called a process manager, and then you get a whole lot of API connections that support the logic apps that are generated. Alrighty, so if we wanted to look at what we got for, say, the FTP scenario, so that we did this last week, or at least what's being used. When you deploy the FTP scenario, you'll get everything. So you'll get all the message bus stuff and all the system application stuff and your application. So the FTP scenario is using all the message bus stuff. And then in the system application, it's only using the service bus. So it's using the message bus topic and some subscriptions, and it's using a topic publisher and a content promoter. And that's it, because it's using a pass-through receive pipeline and a pass-through send pipeline and nothing else. You might wonder why there's a content promoter. I did wonder that at first, but looking into it, one of the things that a receive location does for you, or BizTalk does for you, is it promotes some properties automatically. So specifically, it promotes the receive port name and the receive port ID. So even though you're not using like the XML receive pipeline that promotes, context properties based on a property schema, and also doesn't promote the message type, you still need the receive port name and receive port ID promoted. Because if you remember, if you create a send port that subscribes to the receive port, that subscription has the receive port name or ID in there. So those things need to be promoted. And then you end up with a receive port logic app for FTP using FTP and a send port logic app using FTP. You end up with a topic subscriber that subscribes to the message box to get the message that we're sending out the send port. And then we get a set of API connections. All right, so for the file scenario, the one that we're showing today, it doesn't need, if you've already deployed the FTP scenario, it doesn't need to deploy any of these things, yeah? So this is kind of wrong, actually, thinking about it, because this is supposed to show what's being used. It does use all these, but it doesn't deploy them when you've already got them deployed. So in terms of what's being used, we are using Service Bus, but in addition, we're using an XML processor, an XML translator, and XML validator as we run through. And a content promoter. I missed that out. All right, so the XML translator and validator, because they were in the, I'm now wondering if that's actually correct, Andrew, because I think you showed me in BizTalk we were using the pass-through receive pipeline, weren't we?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we did this, we were kind of assuming that just from the name of it, that it would be XML in, XML out. But actually, when we looked at the deployed one, it was actually using the pass-through pipeline, not the XML send.
Okay.
Maybe that was an oversight on Microsoft's part.
Yeah, maybe. Well, in that case, it will be using content promote, XML translate. Those are the two it will be using. XML processor replicates what the XML disassembler does, which is quite a lot, really, in BizTalk. And in the XML disassembler, you can specify whether you want to validate the incoming XML, or you can use a custom pipeline. So I doubt that's being used, but definitely in the application for this scenario, we end up with a file receive port, a file send port, a topic subscriber, and some API connections to support it all. Alrighty. So a couple of things about deploying this, tricks for new players. One of the things when you come to deploy this, and I don't think we might have mentioned this last week, Andrew, I can't remember, but if you want to run the deploy all script that gets generated, you have to install, well, the best thing to do is install Windows Terminal, and you need to install the Azure CLI. So I don't have a link onto it here, but maybe we can paste one up. But the Azure CLI is used by the deployment scripts.
Yeah, what you can do, because what we did say last week was that if you're deploying the BizTalk Migrator, you install it from Chocolatey.
Yes, you can.
So if you've already got Chocolatey, you can just do a Choco install Azure CLI. Yeah,
that's a good point, actually. Yeah. So you need the Azure CLI, and you'll soon know if you don't have it, because when you try and run the deploy all script, it will fail. It'll come up saying doesn't recognize the term AZ. Another thing we need for this, because we're using the file system, or because this scenario uses the file system connector, you need to have OPDG installed. So at least for now, the file system connector in Logic Apps has to use OPDG. Even if you're connecting to a local, like a file system in the cloud, you still need OPDG. So you can download it using this link here. And when you download it, you install it on your computer, your VM, or wherever, somewhere where you're going to be accessing the files. It could be a VM in Azure, doesn't matter. When you install OPDG, it's going to ask you for an account, an Azure account to log in to. It'll ask for your password as well, and that's because it registers OPDG up in Azure in your subscription. A couple of things to bear in mind. One is that you'll want to make sure that the region it uses is going to be hopefully the same region that you're installing everything else in. So I tend to do things in UK South, but it could be US Central or whatever. The second thing to remember is that the account that you use to sign in, the account that you use to install OPDG, has to be the same account you're going to use to configure the gateway further down. And this is a classic gotcha with OPDG. If you happen to use one account on the machine you've installed OPDG, and then you use your own account to log into the portal, you'll find you can't find the installation anywhere because it links them up by that user. So install it. Hopefully you've only got one user. The reason I mentioned this actually about this signing in is that if you've created, say, a pay-as-you-go subscription or a trial subscription, OPDG requires a work account or a corporate account to register. You can't use a Microsoft account. So if you've created, say, a trial subscription, you probably only have a Microsoft account. You've created an Outlook account or a Hotmail account or something like that. So what you'll want to do is go into your subscription and go to Azure Active Directory and create a new account. So for example, I created one called opdg.service and add a password to it. And then I was able to come back locally and install OPDG using that new account because it's now a corporate account. And then I had to log into the portal using that account to do the next couple of steps. And I'll show you that in a second. You'll need to create the local folders. The scenario by default is using some folders called on the C drive, C BizTalk app/input and C BizTalk app/output. You can change that by going into the Logic app and changing the values if you want to. Then when you've created those folders, you also need to have either a local or a domain account that can be used by the Logic app to access your machine. So I don't know if you've used OPDG before in the file system connector, this will all make sense. And there's some good guides out there on Microsoft Docs, but I've created, because I'm running on a VM, I've created a local user called opdg.service, and I've given it access to those folders. And then the next thing you're going to want to do, you can do this as part of the deploy all, but I tend to do it manually, is that there is something called a data gateway resource. So in the portal, it's called an on-premises data connection, which is a data gateway, sorry. It's a little bit confusing because it's got the same name as the OPDG service itself, but they're two separate things. OPDG here is the service that's running on your local VM or your local machine. And then this gateway resource, also called OPDG, is a resource that you create so that your Logic apps can connect to the gateway. And I'll show you that. But there's in this folder here, conversion application, system application, endpoints, file data gateway, is a script to run. Now, a couple of things around this. When you deploy OPDG, it wants you to name it. And the easiest thing to do is use the name that is in the file that's in here. If you use that name, then this script will work. If you name OPDG something else, you have to come in and change the name in this script. And what I'll do is I'll show you quickly now what that means. So if I come in and find this here. So if I come into my folders in here, here's conversion, and I come down to applications, system application, endpoints, and file data gateway. And you can see there's a number of different files in here. There's an ARM template, there is an ARM template parameters file, and then there's a PowerShell parameters file. It's this one I want to look at. So if we open that up, you'll see that this here is the installation display name. Yeah. So the OPDG that I install on my machine is expecting to be called this. So if I call it something else when I install it, when I run the installation, the MSI, I've got to then update this file before I deploy the gateway resource in Azure. So it's easier if you just use what this is here. And then once you've done that, you can then run this PowerShell script here. And what that does is it deploys the gateway resource. And what that looks like, that gateway resource, if I come over here to Azure and I come down to the system application, I should find in here a connection gateway. There it is there. And you see that the type of resource is on-premises data gateway. So it's an Azure resource as opposed to the on-premises data gateway software you installed locally. So this is, connection gateway, CGW, everything else. If you go back to that file that we had a second ago, give me 1 second to open it up again. This file here, it's GTW. So that's the name of the service that's installed in your local machine. Yeah. But what's up in Azure is CGW. Okay, because they're two different things. I always find this very confusing when I'm installing on-premises data gateway. I've kind of got my head around it, but first time through. So this here is what Logic apps or your API connections use to find the installation. So you've got to have that up and running first. So I'm just saying that one of the things you can do is run this separately, run the deploy script for this separately, and that's what's in this folder here. It deploys that and make sure everything is going to work. So make sure that it can find your installation and it's got access and everything like that. When you run this installation, you've got to be logged in as the same user that the OPDG service was installed at, the thing I mentioned earlier on. So if you happen to have multiple accounts, or you've got a Microsoft account that you use to log into the portal, and you've now had to create a separate corporate account to use with OPDG, what you have to do is come into wherever you're running AZ CLI from, and you'll have to do an AZ login, and it will bring up a window to do your logging in, and I will then choose my corporate account here as opposed to my Microsoft account, and I'm now logged in as that user, and then I can come back here and I can run that this deployment here. So that deploy 30, I can now run that if I have to switch to the folder, and it will create this resource and make sure it's all hooked up. And then I can come back and do AZ login and switch back to the account I like to use again. So I can just come back and switch back. If you're using the same account for everything, if you've got a corporate account for everything, that's fine. You don't need to switch between these. But if you happen to have set up a trial account for testing all this out, then it's worth knowing all this because it can trip you up. Alrighty, so now we've got that set up, then we can run the deploy all. So at the top here of the conversion output folder, we've got a deploy all, and you can go back out to Windows Terminal and switch back to that folder and just run deploy all, and it will run, just like we did with the FTP scenario last week. If you've already deployed a scenario using the same region and the same unique deployment ID, this won't take that long. I think it's somewhere around 12 minutes. But it's not the 40 minutes it takes for a full deployment, including APIM. If you've changed the unique deployment ID or you've changed the region, it will just do a whole new deployment. And again, you can deploy these things manually if you want to. You can bring them into GitHub events or GitHub Actions or Azure pipelines, DevOps pipelines. Looking at what's in these folders, we had a look at some of this last week, but we've got Message Bus, which, as I mentioned in the earlier slide, has got the artifact store, which is an integration account, and config manager and the routing manager and a single workflow. And then we also have, under applications, we've got the system application, and that's got all those logic apps we talked about, so content demoter and promoter and JSON decoder and all the rest. Then we've got some endpoints. We've got the file gateway, and there's a message constructor as well, logic app, and various other bits and pieces. And then for every BizTalk application, so in our case that will be every MSI, you'll have a folder for your BizTalk application, which will be named aim dash, and then the name of your BizTalk application. Because bear in mind that you can supply multiple MSIs. So you could supply 15 MSIs if you wanted to, and you'd get a single report covering all those BizTalk applications, and you'd get a folder per application. And they have a similar layout. You've got endpoints, which is where you find your file send and receive, sorry, your send ports and your receive ports in here. So in our case, we've got a receive location and a send port. We've got the actual resource group that's created. We've got what are called intermediaries. So those are generally logic apps that aren't a receive port or send port. So in this case here, a topic subscriber. Yeah. Then we've got information about the messages, so the schemas and transforms. So these are all the schemas. And in fact, each of these will deploy. It's got a copy of the schema. In this case here, there's the XSD file, the schema file, and some deployment scripts to deploy it to the integration account. And then we've got the transforms. So in here, we've got a couple of XSLTs and how we deploy them to the integration account as well. All right, and then config. So we won't talk about config too much here, but this whole thing is driven by configuration. And the configuration gets put into Azure App Configuration, and there are routing slips, which are the path that we take to get through. So they describe like the pipeline, for example. There's the routing properties, which generally tend to contain things like the context properties that have been promoted, and then configuration entries, which are the general configuration entries for each intermediary or receiver location. So for example, if we look inside the file receiver location, we'll find that there is a configuration entry in here. And if I open that up, you'll see that I've got an entry for the file receive adapter, which talks about, what's the file mask, for example, we're using. So these are the properties in BizTalk where you would go into the receiver location and change the properties. This is where you change them. This is where you find them, at least, anyway. We'll have to talk about how you change them because it's not as easy as it could be, although speaking with Microsoft, it will become easier. Then for each step in the path, so in this case here, we're going through the file receive adapter, the XML message processor, the translator, there's a content promoter, a topic publisher. So we're running through all that. Yeah. Alrighty. Actually, that's interesting, Andrew, because that indicates that the MSI that we processed did have the XML receive pipeline in there, because this is what you see when you use the XML receive pipeline. So
yeah, so we definitely had XML receive. It was passed through on the send side that we saw.
Ah, yes, I got it. Okay, sorry, I got a bit confused. I thought we were talking about the receive. Yes. So yes, if we've got the XML receive, that's the built-in BizTalk pipeline, and that contains the XML disassembler. That's all that's in there. And that's been split out into a number of different intermediaries. So the XML message processor, you actually will recognize, people will probably recognize these properties: allow unrecognized messages, validate document, recoverable interchange processing. Those are all things that the XML message disassembler, the XML disassembler does. And you can either add that in as a custom pipeline or use the built-in XML receive. And then the translator here represents the maps. Now, you talked about this, didn't you? That there are 2 maps on the receive port, aren't there?
Yeah. So depending on which message type comes through, it'll select one of 2 different maps. Okay.
So when the tool has run through, and I guess this was in the, can't remember where this gets put in the binding file. I think it's in the binding file. It's pulled all that out, and it has put the message type here. So it's used the BizTalk message types and has said that when you get this message type, use this map. And when you get this message type, use this map. And I guess if you get a message that's not recognized, it will not run a map at all. Although obviously this is set to false here. So there's also an allow unrecognized messages option here on the translator as well. So if that's true, it means that if you have a message type that's not in this list of maps, it will allow it through. And then topic publisher saying, we're using a topic called message box and blah, blah, blah. Alrighty, so I've talked for a long time. I'm just going to go back here to the.
Well, it's amazing, isn't it, that one of the things that is really apparent with this is that having BizTalk as a product gives you so much framework stuff that when you actually have to try and rebuild that, it's amazing how many different moving parts there actually are to construct that out. So that's it's even though the BizTalk Migrator has generated that for you, it's still sort of it's still sort of showing you all the components. There is a lot of things in there.
That's exactly right. I guess that's one of the things that as a BizTalk developer, when you come along and use BizTalk and you've installed it and you do pick up a file and drop it out the other side and you're like, oh, that worked. You don't know everything that's going on under the covers to make that possible for you. If you had to write a tool that did that yourself, say in .NET, you might go, okay, I'll just write a console app and it will run and come out the side. Okay, well, how are you hosting that? How are you going to have that so it starts up and stops? Well, I'll write it as a Windows service. Okay, cool. How are you handling logging? How are you going to handle recovering? How are you going to handle spreading that across multiple machines? And at that point, you start to think about, okay, so it's doing quite a lot. Okay, cool. Now I want you to change it to use FTP. You're like, okay. So BizTalk, obviously does a lot under the covers, and so there's a huge amount here. This is, if we go back to quickly looking at what's been deployed, this is the resource group here for the message bus. Now these things here, this got deployed when I deployed the FTP scenario last week. So these haven't changed. This is all exactly the same. All that's changed at the moment is the what's gone into the config effectively and what's gone into the artifact store. And then the system application here, and again, none of this has changed. This was all deployed last time. The only thing that's new is this connection gateway resource. That wasn't there last time because we didn't need it for the FTP scenario, but the rest of all this stuff is all there. If we look in the service bus namespace and then look at the topics and we find the message bus topic and look at the subscriptions in here, we will find that we now have a new subscription. So last week we just had the FTP one. Now we've got one for the file send port as well. If we come back out, we'll see up here we've got the FTP pass-through resource group from last week, and now we have a new one, and this is the one for the file system. So in here we've got a number of API connections. Then we've got 3 logic apps. We've got one for the file receive adapter, send adapter, and topic subscriber. So remember, as I mentioned, that the way that Microsoft have done this is that a send port is generally split into 2 things. You've got subscribing to the message, and you've got sending it out through the adapter. So the send part is specific to whatever adapter you've chosen. So in this case here, we have a send for file S adapter. And I'm guessing the names have been limited because there's a max length for names. Then we have the API connections here. So we've got one for subscribing to the message box and one for publishing to the message box. And then we've got the 2 here for the file system. In fact, these 2 are really important to realize. Remember the steps I mentioned earlier on about you configure OPDG, you set up the connection gateway, and you've now created that local account. If I come in here and I look at the API connection for the receive part, in here, this has come from the configuration file. So by default, this will probably be wrong. If you've got a different folder for where you are picking your files up from, then you want to change this. Now, this isn't actually the folder it picks up files from. This is what's called the root folder. So what that's used for is when you go into a logic app that has the file system connector in it, and you click the button on the right to the picker, the file picker, to choose a folder, it will start on your PC from this location. So you could set that at C, or C BizTalk app or whatever, The username and password are the important things. You have to put in here the computer name or the domain name and your account and the password. And if you don't have those in, then when you go into the logic app, you'll get an error. And that's actually one way of testing that the logic app is working. You can effectively come out of here, go back to the resource group for XML. I can come into the file receive logic app, edit it, and come into the properties here. And it's using parameters here, but I can just, without saving anything, I can click here, I can go here, and if everything is set up right, I should now see the folders that are in there. So I'm seeing a folder called in archive, which is in my input folder. So it's correctly connecting to my VM from Azure. If you get an error in here, it means you've got a problem somewhere, probably with your API connection or your ODB. I can never get it right. On-prem OPDG setup configuration. Cool. And the last thing is running this. So it's very easy to run. All I have to do is come to my input and output folders. BizTalk app.
Almost like running a BizTalk demo.
Almost like running a BizTalk demo. Exactly right. Here we go. One thing that's different. BizTalk, you can run in a number of modes, and one of the things you can do you know what, Andrew? I can't remember. I know with the FTP adapter, you can tell it to delete files, but with the file adapter here, if I want to, if it's already processed a file, Logic Apps will remember the name of the file even if I delete it. So if I want to do a new file, I either have to modify this file or create a new file. So
yeah, because with BizTalk, it just it pulls the folder and it always it destroys the file on receipt, and then it doesn't care if you put something in of the same name.
I know with the FTP, the new FTP adapter now supports. Oh, I'll push the insert button. The new FTP adapter now supports not deleting files. So what it does is it maintains a list in SSO of all the files it's processed. So it won't pick up the same file twice, even if it's still there. But that's just one thing to bear in mind. That's, you know, the FTP connector in Logic Apps does not support that. It would have to be manually put in. So I've now created a new file with a different date. I'll drop that in, and off we go. Now,
did you say that that's still so that behavior is still on happens with the file adapter and OPDG?
No, the FTP adapter in BizTalk has the ability to either delete the file or maintain a list internally. I don't think the file adapter does. I think the file adapter picks it up and deletes it in BizTalk. I can't really remember. I know that the file connector, the file system connector, always maintains a list of files it's picked up. It doesn't delete the file. It's looking for changes in the file. But I've just created a whole new file here. But it's something to bear in mind. If you you drop the file in and it's still there, it's because it knows it's already processed it. Now, quick thing on performance that we've realized. We'll talk about performance on another session, but logic apps or in functions specifically have a startup that if you remember writing an ASP.NET app, the first call always took ages. The cold start. Do you remember cold start? They fixed it in later versions of IIS, but years ago, the first time you called say a WCF function, you'd be waiting a minute before you got a response back. Yeah. Functions and Azure App Config and integration accounts, they all suffer from the same thing. The first time you make a call against them, you've got to wait. It's like, for an integration account, it's like 20 seconds. For Azure App Config, it's 20 seconds. So the very first time you make a call. So
this is because behind the scenes, actually, there are cloud resources being provisioned.
That's exactly being converted.
It's even worse than when you had a server and it just had to load the process into memory.
Exactly.
This is actually sometimes it's actually provisioning a VM and then installing an app on it and then running it.
And they will hang around for a while, like 10, 20 minutes or something like that. And if you get a premium SKU, you can control how long they hang around for. So like you get a premium I'm trying to think of the SKU you need for premium functions. So functions runtime, you can control this functionality. So you've always got a warm start. But it's something to bear in mind. The first time you do even one of these scenarios, it takes a while because everything's got to start up. And then the next time you do it, it's quicker. I don't know. We've played around a bit, making it as quick as possible. But anyway, I've dropped that file in. So now if I come back to my Logic app, hopefully I will see that was the one I tested earlier on today. And if I go back to refresh, I get, oh, it ran. There we go, succeeded. And look, it took 56 seconds that time. Okay. If I do a third file now, if I come up here and I just create, and I've done this within a minute or so of the other one. I put that in there. You'll see that this will pick it up in a minute. Another thing too is that the file system connectors and FTP connectors are polling. So again, you're going to wait. I don't know what the polling setting is set by default. I think it's 30 seconds. So some of this you're going to be waiting 30 seconds before it runs anyway. So even though it took 56 seconds to run, it might have taken almost a minute and a half before you threw your file out. And again, you can change those polling settings by going into the Logic app or the configuration. But when you do that, you're then doing more actions per day, so you've got increased cost. So it's a balance. I can understand why they've got these defaults, but it's up to people to tune these things. It's like
really, if you're dealing with files, you can't. Most file-based applications aren't actually that bothered about time, latency.
I don't want sub-second latency with files generally. And if you do, then you'd be tuning things because you can't have the file system connector doing sub-second latency anyway. So this, I think it's set to 30 seconds. There we go. So now it's picked up the third file I've put in. Let's look in our output folder and we should see, there we go. There's the file that came out a couple of minutes ago, 3 minutes ago. And if we open that up, let's look at our input file. It's this file here. That was our input file. So 1350 GPP, and it's a payment inbound. That's the root node name. And if I look in our output folder, I'll see it's now got a message ID. That should look familiar. And look, I've got a payment outbound. So now, and it should have 1350 in there somewhere. Oh no, it's missing the. Oh no, the amount's over here. Sorry, there it is. There, 1350. Cool. All right. So that worked. That scenario worked, and we can actually, I think, in another session, we'll talk about how you debug it and run through everything that's happened here. It's now succeeded and it's run this, and you'll see now it's taken 30 seconds. Now, something about that 30 seconds, again, polling, that this whole thing is built up around service bus, and the service bus triggers today are polling triggers. So something gets published to Service Bus, you've got a polling trigger that's running every 30 seconds, picks up the file and does something with it. So unless you change the polling, this is not going to run any quicker. And I think Microsoft have probably done the right thing, that they've tried to come up with polling that isn't going to cost people a lot of money. Because if you set the polling at every 1 second and I deployed this application, I'm going to get quite a large bill at the end of the month if I don't shut all this down. So that's one thing to think about. If the performance on this is not as good as you want, change the polling cycles to be less and just realize you'll pay a little bit more for that. This problem changes when we look at logic apps on functions runtime and logic apps running locally, because I believe the charging, the way they do the charging will change. But at the moment, that's how this is. But yeah, as Andrew said, although yes, when you run a BizTalk app, you drop a file in, it comes out a few seconds later. In reality, if you're moving files around, 30 seconds is probably not, it's probably acceptable. And the other thing to bear in mind is that it's 30 seconds no matter how many files you put in. So if you drop in 100 files or 1,000 files, it'll still be 30 seconds. Whereas with BizTalk, it won't. As you ramp up the number of files, what you'll start finding is that the overall throughput is going to start going down.
Yeah,
all right.
And if we just riff on that a little bit. One of the reasons, part of that, obviously you've got the message bus polling, but it's also that we've got these different reusable components, and they're all decoupled. So you have this route and slip router that routes things between them and that sort of thing, and that is a great, a great pattern for maintainability, because you've got one thing of everything. You can always, once you've got this solution, you can always compress some of these things down if performance is a real important thing. But this just gives you, one of the things that Microsoft say about the BizTalk Migrator is that it gets you to a result quicker and cheaper and easier, but it doesn't necessarily get you to the result in one step. You can still, you still got the, it gets you to a really good starting point. But you can all, if performance is really important to you, there's different things you can do, and you can always, you can always optimize from there. But it gives you a really good starting point.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and it's an age-old thing that maybe we'll talk about in another webinar about performance versus configuration. In that, one of the things we haven't talked about here is I can change the route that these things go through. So I can add in the flat file decoder by making a small change in the configuration without deploying anything. Without, it's a little bit like going into BizTalk and changing the pipeline that you're using on a receive location. You can do something similar with this. But if you did everything, say, in one logic app, you wouldn't have that flexibility, although you might get better performance. And I know that one of the suggestions that we had for Microsoft was about optimization. So what if you don't want the configuration, you just want the performance? So I know they're talking about that, and we might see that in a later release. But yeah, cool. So that's the file scenario.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Dan. Shall we? Let's flip back onto the presentation.
Cool.
In a second. So just bear with me, because I'm rubbish at all this.
People get to look at my lovely face for a moment.
Well, they'll still be seeing the previous thing. But yeah, let's just send that live, and even you can even have my mugshot on there for a second. Okay, so we've got a question for everyone out there, and feel free to put it in the Q&A or the chat, and or just send it to me or Dan. But one of the things we really want to know is, we've got loads of content. We've been working with the private preview, through the private preview with BizTalk Migrator since earlier on in the summer, and we've got loads of content we can share on this. And please tell us what's most important for you, because I'm pretty sure that no matter what you need to know, we've got that content, and we're quite happy to share it with you. But just let us know. Just send us, just put it in the chat or send us a message just to say what it is that's important to you, because what we want to make sure of is that our webinars stay as relevant for you as possible. I mean, we're doing our best of what we think is the most important thing. But if you've got something that you really, because ultimately, there's going to be two categories of people on these webinars. One of them is that you work for a company that has BizTalk and you need to migrate some apps, or you work for a technology company that has customers that need to migrate those apps, and whatever helps you the most, then just let us know, and we can we can make sure we get you that information as in the best possible way. So Q&A. So last time the Q&A wasn't really working. Sorry, that was my fault. I didn't tick the enable Q&A box. This time we've got Q&A. So we've just got one question here, and that's from Vivek, and it says, is scope and transaction type maintained in an orchestration related logic? So when we generate a logic app, are scope and transaction type maintained in the orchestration? So so Dan, is that anything you want to answer? Because I think there's a couple of interesting things there, because certainly transactions, certainly atomic transactions, just don't really translate to the world of cloud.
No, they don't. It's a good point, actually, because you've got, if you think about how transactions are used in BizTalk, I've only seen people use them in two different ways. You're actually configuring it because you want a long-running transaction that is going to be a distributed transaction that runs across various things. So when you set up a scope and transactions in BizTalk, and what it's doing is it's opening up a distributed transaction across the message box and BAM and maybe the rules engine, a number of different databases in SQL Server. So if one thing fails, it all gets rolled back. That doesn't make any sense in the cloud. Instead, you'd be implementing something more like compensating transactions. So, even if I was using the SQL adapter, and then if I was, say, for example, I had an orchestration that was retrieving some data from SQL and then making a call into Salesforce. Difficult to do in BizTalk, but let's make that assumption. And what I wanted to have happen is that if the Salesforce call failed, I want to undo the transaction in SQL. You can't do that today. It's not supported. All you can do is compensating transactions. So you'd actually have to catch the failure and then manually undo the change in SQL, because the SQL connector in Logic Apps is, although it supports transactions, once you've moved out of the connector, that transaction's finished. It's an interesting question, though. And actually, we should get the Logic Apps team to talk about that, because I've had internal discussions with them about transactions across SQL and how you could do that. Because in theory, you could do it, but the problem is that you're using the on-premise data gateway at the moment to go to SQL on-prem, and that the on-premise data gateway has a transaction, but it's all done through Service Bus. So it's all unrelated. Scopes is more interesting. If you've got transaction type set to none in an orchestration, that you're probably using scopes for exception handling. So you'll have a scope, and then you'll have catching exceptions and doing something with it. And again, there's no equivalent in Logic Apps at all. There's no ability to throw an exception and catch it and do something different with it.
I mean, certainly you have exception handling, but it's a different pattern, isn't it?
It's a completely different pattern, and there's no concept of like a top level or scope based exception that gets thrown. What there is, though, is in Logic Apps you have a scope object which is designed for a similar functionality. The idea is that you have some actions in there, and if one of them fails, then you've got your run after set properly. Then you exit the scope, and then you can check, did any of the actions in the scope fail? And that allows you to just have a generic run after that says, if anything in the scope failed, go down here. Now that is similar to an orchestration with a scope with a single exception handler that catches any exception. But again, it's a tricky thing. But the question I think you're asking, Vivek, is what does it do today? And the answer is it doesn't do anything. Exceptions the exception code is brought out, and you get scopes created, but it doesn't work. There's nothing in there because the tool, as I understand it, doesn't know how to parse that in an orchestration. Now, BizTalk, Microsoft did tell us that their plan is to keep working on the orchestration support in the tool if people want it. So it's a really good thing to keep messaging Microsoft and say you want better orchestration support or you want more things in there, because there are ways to handle things like this. One of the things, for example, that could be done is that you could identify that something's gone wrong and you could call out to a function, and that function could contain all the code that you would normally have had in your exception handling block. Okay, so that's the exception handling aspect. In terms of transaction types, like atomic transactions, they make no sense. All you could do is try and implement some sort of compensating block in a logic app. So you'd have a run after, you have a scope shape and a run after, and you'd go to another shape, and then you'd have to implement your own code. But there's no automated way of doing that. I can't imagine any way the tool would be able to work out for you what the compensation should be. All it could do is give you a framework. But again, Vivek, if I know in the last Logic Apps Live, Valerie shared an email address, and we should put that on one of our presentations, that you can contact them on. And I think, say you want this, say it's important to you, and hopefully they will prioritize getting it done. I hope that helps.
So that's a great answer to a simple question to ask. One of those ones that isn't really a simple question to answer. So we are kind of just slightly over time now. So what we're going to do, we don't have anything else through the Q&A right now. So so just moving on, we've got a couple of updates. So a couple of weeks ago, so Thursday before last, me and Dan were on Logic Apps Live, and so you can see aka.ms/BizTalk Live, and there's a replay of that on there. It's available on YouTube, and I believe, Dan, you're going to be on Integration Mondays on 30th of November. So
yes, doing a deep dive on the tool. In fact, I don't know, 2 weeks from now. That'll be, so our next session will be after that. So yeah, it'll be very similar to what we do here. It's just, I think, slightly different audience. But one of the things I do want to go through on the Integration Monday is configuration, changing the configuration and showing how you do that and what it does. Because that's one of the things I have mentioned to Microsoft is opaque. It's not well documented and you have to work it out yourself. But yeah, that's a really cool thing to be able to do, because you can start playing with the routing slip, which is awesome. And in fact, you can do more things with it than you can do with BizTalk, which I think is kind of cool.
That's yeah. So really looking forward to that. So look out for that. I haven't actually got a link for that, Dan. But if you search for Integration Mondays, you should be able to find that and sign up. And then finally, or almost finally, next webinar. So we are going to look at code next time. We're going to look at the repos, and we're going to do a bit of debugging, and we're going to do a bit more, a bit more techie on how this, on the nuts and bolts of how this stuff works. And so do tune in for that one. So 1st of December. I can't believe 2 weeks time it's December. How did that happen?
I know.
It's what on earth has happened this year? It's almost just the year's flown by. It's almost as if we've had big things to preoccupy us with.
What could have happened this year?
What could have happened? So 2 p.m. Same time, 2 weeks time, 1st of December, we'll be having a look at the code base and repos. So and last thing, do get in touch. So there's my contact details, there's Dan's contact details. You can connect with us on LinkedIn, send us an email. Always love to hear from you. And finally, that was brought to you by Affinis and 345. So Dan is CTO of Affinis, I'm director of 345, and we've been really, really glad to have everyone on board today, and really, really enjoyed having the webinar. And we will see you next time. So so thanks a lot for that, everyone, and we'll wrap up there. Okay.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
All right. Cheers, Dan. Bye now.